Hello, friends. You're listening to the Outside the Walls podcast. I'm Chris Dirksen. This is the second part of a two-part conversation Chris Lone and I had with Daniel Bannoura, a Christian Palestinian who literally grew up in the town of Bethlehem. If you have not yet listened to that first part, you need to go back and listen to that. And if you haven't listened to the recent interview we did with scholar Gary Burge, where we discussed biblical theology in the land of Israel, you should go back and listen to that as well. The point of us having this conversation with Daniel, it was simply to break down some of the stereotypes many of us evangelical Christians have about Palestinians. Too many of us have a very flat and dehumanizing view of the Palestinian people, that they are all angry Muslims who want to kill all the Jews. Nothing could be further from the truth. Many of us have been raised in churches where we were taught to love Israel. I know I was, but never taught to love the Palestinians. We need to keep loving the Jews in Israel, absolutely, but equally we need to love Palestinians. They too equally are people made in God's image with hopes and dreams and fears in this world. The best way I know how to tear down a stereotype is to meet someone in person and just talk to them and listen to them. You don't have to agree with them, just listen to them. That's what we're doing in this conversation with Daniel Bannoura. In this second part of the conversation, Daniel shares the deep roots his family and the Palestinian people have in general, have in the land we now call Israel. As a Palestinian with family roots in the Holy Land going back hundreds of years, Daniel's perspective of the history of modern Israel might be quite different from yours and mine. That's okay. You don't need to automatically accept Daniel's view of history, but at the very least, we should be challenged to realize that history is often a lot more complex than we make it out to be. We too easily fall into the trap of oversimplifying history, turning history into good guys who are all good versus bad guys who are all bad. Those sorts of overly simplistic historical views can be very damaging because they allow us to not empathize with huge groups of people, whole groups of people that we don't care about, that we write off, that we don't pray for, that we don't love. At the end of this conversation, Daniel shares his dream for the Middle East, a day of peace when his children can go to school with Jewish children and invite their Jewish friends over for supper, and when Jews and Palestinians of all beliefs can share the Holy Land with friendship and love. I pray this conversation inspires us all to be more careful about the way we judge various people groups in the Middle East. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Outside the Walls podcast. We're back with our Christian Palestinian friend Daniel Bannoura, and we're talking again about Israel and the Palestinians. Again, many Christians in this area, many who are listening to this right now, many of us have never actually listened to a Palestinian person or a Christian Palestinian person. So when we think of Israel, we have sort of this idea of, it's this amazing prophecy and God brought the Jews back into the land. But we rarely think of it from the other side of it, which is, were there other people in the land when the Jews, did anyone lose their land when the Jews came into the land? And so we're talking again today with Daniel Bannoura. Thank you, Daniel, for being on the podcast. And we're going to just jump right into this again with a question. How far back do your roots, Daniel, go in the land of Israel?
Hi, Chris and Chris. It's good to be back with you guys. It's a good question. Palestinians have been around for generations. We don't even know. We've been around since as far as we can tell. For example, my family, which is not a significant family, the Bannoura family, has been living in Beit Sahur, the shepherd's field by Bethlehem, for at least, I can count 14 generations.
Wow.
So, I have the whole, family tree of my ancestors who have been living here for 14 generations in Beit Sahur, in the shepherd's field. Beit Sahur is the Arabic word for the biblical area that is the shepherd's field.
Okay.
And Christians in Palestine, we've always been there. We did not come from anywhere else. And we say this, we can't really prove it. We don't have the documentary evidence or DNA evidence, but we say that Christians have been around since the beginning of Christianity, since Pentecost. 2,000 years ago, Christians appeared as a people group, and we continue to be in the land since then, since the Church of Jerusalem, since Pentecost.
But by the way, you have a lot deeper, just for comparison, and I think a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to this. 14 generations, your family goes back at least in this one little area in the Holy Land. My family, many of us in Steinbach here in Canada, my roots in this area of Canada only go 4 generations. It was my great-grandfather that came here
right.
from Russia. Many of us in this area are like 3, 4, 5,
Right,
whereas
yeah.
you guys are way deeper.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's why, see, this is why I have an issue with using the term Israel to describe my background
right.
and my land. Is like, if you talk with an Israeli now, you ask him where you're from, he would tell you, I'm from Brooklyn, I'm from Poland, I'm from Germany, and just like you, perhaps, 3, maybe 2, 3, 4 generations back. But then I am just like an average Palestinian, and I can tell you, I've been in the land for 14 generations, and that's kind of the thing, because Israel for us as natives is an imposition, and we can deal with the history of it, I think, in a bit. But it's a colonial implant into Palestine that brought in foreigners to come and take the land and confiscate the land and control the people of that land. And that's different from, the whoever, Israelis and so on, who call themselves Israelis, who are like, can trace the, they just came here, came to the land like months ago or years ago or a generation ago, and it's different. So there's that kind of tension there between the European Jew or the American Jew who comes and settles and the land becomes his, and they get an Israeli citizen, and they citizenship and they become citizens. And there's the indigenous Palestinian who's been ignored for the most. But yeah, so Palestinian Christians, Palestinians in general, can trace their roots back to generations and generations. As part of the larger Middle East of native folks who settled in cities and towns and farmlands, and and you have the big Asian cities in Palestine like Jerusalem, like Bethlehem has always been a small town, but then you have Nazareth and you have Haifa and you have what we call Jaffa, which is today's Tel Aviv. These have been, major economic and political and religious cities, and that's where people settled and lived and built their homes and called that place home for them. And so that's kind of, we are very rooted in the land, where there's an expression we say we are like the olive trees. I don't know if you know this about olive trees. They live for a long time, for generations and generations, hundreds of years sometimes, but also their roots go deep and wide, so they're very rooted. When the olive tree dies, it dies in place. It doesn't fall over. It's a very short kind of tree. So it's a very rooted and strong tree, and kind of Palestinians compare themselves to the olive trees that they harvest, that they're well rooted in the land, and they cannot fall down. They can only die standing in their land.
Thank you so much. So let's just maybe focus then on, can you give us kind of a picture of who was living in the land the year leading up to 1948? And there might be some repetition in your answer, but just to kind of give us a picture of who was living in the land, prior to 1948.
It's a complicated question, Chris. I encourage people not to just rely on this conversation. There are a lot of books out there, a lot of resources, and whether it's on YouTube or books written by historians, I can recommend, for example, Rashid Khalidi, 100 Years War in Palestine. I can recommend books by Ilan Pape, an Israeli historian who wrote on this. Nur Masalha, The Expulsion of the Palestinians. And so there's a lot of books that kind of specifically discuss what happened in 1948 and the history before and after. But before the Zionist movement became a movement, this kind of ethno-religious political ideology that says the land belongs to Jews, and Jews from Europe can come and take the land from the natives. The majority of the people who what we call today Palestinians had been mostly Arabic speaking. We also have and we continue to have some ethnic and linguistic minorities like Syriac Christians and Armenians and what have you. But for the most part, they had been Arabic speaking Palestinians, mostly Muslims, and a sizable minority of Christians. By the Christians were about 11% of the population. And then you had a decent minority of native Jews who lived alongside other Arabs in the land. So they would be Palestinian Jews who spoke Arabic, but who practiced Judaism as a small minority, just like other minorities like Christians and Samaritans and Baha'is and so on who lived in the land.
Sorry, there was actual Samaritans? They were called Samaritans?
Yeah, we still have them. We still have
Really?
Samaritans, yeah. And they still do Passover, and they have their own practices. They live on the Mount of Gerizim,
No
right now.
kidding.
So cool.
Yeah, you
Wow.
can. It's a small community. I think there are about like 1,000 of them. A very enclosed community. I actually went to their Pesach, their Passover celebration a few years ago. It's been something like incredible to see, to behold, like the whole practices of sacrificing and so on. Yeah, you can read up on them, and yeah, they're incredible. So yeah, and you have the Druze as well. You have the Baha'is. You have different communities. Palestine. Maybe this is a distraction here. Maybe there's a side note, but the idea of Palestine, like what we say when we say what we mean when we say Palestine, the idea of Palestine is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious society that includes so many different people groups that can call the place home. They can live in it, and they can take care of it, and they can be neighborly to each other.
And by the way, sorry, Daniel, this is just so good and fascinating. Like, I think a lot of us, I know myself in the past, I sort of had this idea that the Holy Land was this like empty land. Like there was like like really nobody living there. And it was just this desert. And then Israel just kind of came in, and the Jews came in and took a land that was nobody's. Like, so like pre-19, can you give us a sense of like how many people were living there? What, like this idea that it's empty, where did that come from? Or I don't know, maybe you've never heard of that.
That's a good question.
Yeah, the myth, the slogan that was used by Zionists, Christians first, and then Jews, which is that it's a land without a people for a people without a land. That this
exactly. Yeah.
That Palestine was an empty land, and then conveniently it was looking for people, and then look, you have the Jews who had no land. Obviously, this is a myth. This is not fact, and I mean, and also like there's a very sinister element to this. I'll address in a bit. Like, why would you make up this idea? But it's convenient, right? Like, what kind of story you wanna tell to justify the taking of the land that doesn't belong to you? Well, you just basically claim that it's empty, and therefore you can take it over. Yeah. Just like the U.S. was empty, right? Who are these savages who live there? They don't count as people. Just like Canada, what is called Canada today, was empty. You have these people in the background, and they're kind of half naked and not educated. They don't speak our language. They're not really people. They're just some people in the background. And that's the same ideology. And I think the sinister element is this, right? That you can dehumanize people. You can say they do not exist, and you can do whatever you want with them, right? So you can you become subhuman. You don't really exist. You're not a people. You don't have an identity. You're nothing, and therefore we can take your land because you don't really matter. You don't even belong to the land because you're not a person. You don't have a home. You're just a savage.
Yeah.
And that's a legacy of what we call Orientalism in the Middle East. The term has coined by an academic, Edward Said, who talks about this kind of attitude towards Muslims and Arabs historically to be the savages, the uneducated, the uncultured, the unchristian, the dark, who need enlightenment, who need culture. And that's kind of that legacy of Orientalism is what kind of gave sense and power and potency to colonization. Right? These are the savages that we can take over. And the savage has always been there, right? There's the black savage, there's a native savage, right? There's the Arab savage. So Orientalism is part of that colonial discourse that was very prevalent in the Western imagination. I'm digressing, but I think I need to give these kind of perspectives to kind of help people can understand what's happening. Also, just one small comment as well. Do we seriously think that the Holy Land, this is like the most important real estate in the history of humanity, to be empty? Like, do we seriously think that Jerusalem and Nazareth were just empty? Like how does this work? Like, I know maybe people do not really know geography, like world history and world geography, but just think about it. Like, seriously, this is the most contested real estate piece in the world. And suddenly, conveniently, by the late 19th century, early 20th century was empty. It's ridiculous. But then people just buy into just buy this stuff. But I'm saying, Chris, that this idea is for me is inherently racist, because I become insignificant. I become a subhuman. I'm dehumanized with that language. But to answer the question specifically, by the early 20th century, I think the numbers we have per the Ottoman census, the Ottomans used to compare the whole Middle East, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, and so on. you had around 700,000 Palestinians. And then by 1948, their numbers jumped, I think, to almost 1 million Palestinians, and which is kind of basically natural growth. And, and then also, and then almost, I think, 400 or 300 Jews who migrated into Palestine. Some Jews were migrating into Palestine by the 19th century, but then with the rise of Zionism in the late 19th century, we had these kind of movements of European Jews into Palestine, what they call it, the Aliyah, the travel to Palestine. And then especially that went up dramatically, the number of Jewish migrants into Palestine after World War II and the Holocaust and the crimes, the atrocious crimes committed against Jews in Europe. And so many of them were kind of fled. And that was abetted and supported by the British Empire that was controlling Palestine in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. Part of European dealing, what do you do with the Jews? What they call the Jewish problem. And for them, the solution to the Jewish problem was to ship them off of Europe. The British controlled Palestine after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. There's something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France, whereby they divided the Middle East. So Syria and Lebanon would go to France. Palestine, Jordan, Iraq would go to Britain. These were colonial powers that were controlling someone else's land. And they facilitated through, since 1917, there's something called the Balfour Declaration of 1917, whereby the Prime Minister of the time, Lord Balfour, sent this letter saying that the British Empire looks favorably to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And since then, the British facilitated the movement of Jews from Europe into Palestine. And that created eventually that demographic problem, right? Like, initially, Palestinians did not really pay attention to who were coming in. It's like they didn't really mind. But then eventually they came to understand the ideology of Zionism and how it went hand in hand with the British Empire. And they started translating tracts and writings by Zionists. And they understood this is a big issue, that they're planning to take over the land. They were duped by the British, saying the British are just going to take over. They're going to be caretakers for a certain time. And then they would have a homeland for themselves. But then eventually the British Empire played the Arabs and the Palestinians and moved towards establishing a Jewish homeland, as was promised in 19th for the Jewish migrants who came into Palestine. And that led to some different processes. The history is complicated and messy, but there's this kind of idea of partition to divide up the land between the Palestinians and the Jewish migrants, whereby the Jewish minority, around 30% of the population, would get the majority of the land, specifically very important economic, political, and arable land at the coast, and cities like Jaffa and Ashdod and so on. Like these were economic hubs for trade and so on. And then you had the massive kind of Galilee area where a lot of Palestinians lived. And I don't know how you feel about some foreign entity telling you to give your property to someone else. Palestinians said, no, we're not going to give up the majority of our land to these Jewish Europeans. We're happy to share the land with them, but we refuse to partition the land. And that was so the partition plans were rejected. If Chris thinks someone comes to your house and says, hey, can I rent a piece of land that you have, some acres of land, can I buy some of it? And then you'd let them like squat or like even rent or even buy a part of it, like a 1 acre of your, 100-acre land property. But then they would come to you with power and weapons and say, actually, I want the majority of your land. I want your bedroom. I want your swimming pool. I want your arable land. What are you going to do, right? You're not going to be okay with that. And the Palestinians were not okay with the British Empire telling them what to do with their land. These are people, like I said, who have been living in that land and cultivating it and establishing their homes and so on and so forth for generations. Eventually, partition plans did not work. Palestinians rejected the plans and would not be okay with a Jewish majority control over their land. Mm-hmm. And that led eventually to... Yeah,
just insert here for just a moment. So in the 1940s, I want those numbers just to kind of just stick out for people. So you had about 1 million Palestinians in the land, and then about 300,000 for Jews, and then
one third of the population was Jewish. That's kind of
Okay.
the numbers I have in mind. So maybe my numbers are not the most accurate right
Yeah.
now, but basically
somewhere in that area.
a minority of the population was Jewish. But I think almost 1 million were Palestinians, and then I don't know, half of that or less was Jewish. Now, the Zionist project was predicated on the idea to create a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. And that necessitated to being a majority. How can you have a Jewish homeland if you're a minority in that land? So what do you do? How do you establish a Jewish homeland if you remain to be the minority? And that led to 1948, 47 and 48 and 49, led to massacres were committed by Jewish militias that were aiming to maximize their control of the land by pushing the Palestinians out. So this is what the Palestinians call the Nakba, Nakba, what Israel calls the War of Independence, but what Palestinians call the Nakba, or this is the Arabic word for the catastrophe, by which Jewish militias committed horrible massacres in many villages and towns around in all of historic Palestine. You can look this up. I mentioned Ilan Pappé, an Israeli historian. He wrote the book The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. How do you establish a Jewish homeland? Through transfer, through pushing the people out and squatting and taking over their land. And that's what happened in 1948. By the end of it, beginning in 1947, before there was any kind of official war, the majority Palestinians were pushed out of the land. And by the end of the war, you have 750,000 Palestinian refugees who were pushed out of historic Palestine, what is today called Israel. So, think of Tiberias, think of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and so on. And so many different villages, small communities, 750,000 of them were pushed out and became refugees. But today, we have 5 million Palestinian refugees. The 750,000, now today are 5 million who still live in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza Strip. I'm going to come back to Gaza Strip in a bit. And also in diaspora. For example, the majority of Jordan, today the country of Jordan, is Palestinian. You have many refugee camps in Syria. Before you had, any other refugees in Syria or otherwise, or in Lebanon. The majority of the Palestinian, the refugees live in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria as refugees. 76 years later, they're still holding on to the keys, hoping to go back. They have what is called the right of return. If you had to escape your home because of war, you have a right to return to that home, as recognized by the international community, by the UN. There's a UN resolution that grants Palestinians the right of return. And that continues to be the case. They are still waiting in the refugee camps 76 years later. So about Gaza, 70% of the population of Gaza is a refugee population who do not belong in the Gaza Strip. These are people, the ancestors, 3 generations or 4 generations of people who left, who were forced out, who escaped what was happening, and they fled to Gaza. So, the Israeli hostages are not the only people who do not belong in Gaza. Also, 70% of the population does not belong in Gaza and has a right, just like the Israeli hostages, to go back to their homes. But for some reason, we only focus on the Israeli hostages, but we ignore, and the audacity, the political, historical ignorance and dehumanization of the Palestinians. We only center the humanity of the Israeli hostages, which has to be centered. But also we ignore 76 years of these people who are hostages in Gaza against their will and are not given the right to return back to their homes, of 76 years. So it's not, and so we have to have that conversation about the hostages. They have to go back, right? But also the refugees have to go back. Also, Palestinian hostages in Israeli jails. 7,000 Palestinians were kidnapped and arrested by the Israeli military, mostly in the West Bank. Hostages taken by the Israeli military. Do they have the right to go back to their land as well? But anyway, so this is like a long and messy issue for sure. And, again, not to justify what happened. I mean, many atrocities were committed and war crimes were committed by both sides on that day. But also like to understand that kind of the trauma of a people who have been oppressed, who have been victimized, who have been imprisoned for 76 years in the Gaza Strip and are now finally, like, in many ways, kind of breaking free out of the jail, out of prison, and going back to their land. So anyway, so that's kind of what happened in 1948. By the end of it, Israel was established. Palestinians were pushed out. Now Jews have majority control over the land. 78% of the land by the end of the war in 49 became Israeli. And then the rest of the land, 22% of the land, was the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That was kind of the armistice line. That's when kind of they had like a break or an armistice agreement. And the majority, the Palestinians were kind of stuck in these areas. The majority of them were made into refugees outside of the borders of Palestine. But now, by the end of the war, Jews had control over the majority of Palestine. Palestine now becomes Israel, and Jews have military control and also control over the land and the resources of historic Palestine.
But so why, when the UN created Israel as a Jewish state, so it specifically created it as a Jewish state, why did they not create a state, which again, I think it's so important for us to just actually even think about that. I don't think many of us think about that. Like, Canada isn't an ethnic state of any kind. Like, it's Canada, it's a nation, but we have many ethnicities, but specifically Israel's a Jewish state. Right.
Yeah.
Why did they not create it as a democratic state of Jews and Palestinians voting together? Like, how did that not happen? Like, I don't know that. Why? Do you know why or what?
Yeah, I mean, it's by 48 we're talking about 50 years of Zionist lobbying. I think that the Holocaust had really impacted this a great deal. Through Zionism, the idea was like Jews can never be safe until they have power, until they have their own homeland. And as long as Jews are minorities, they will always be oppressed and victimized and attacked. So I think the Holocaust played a major role there. I think that idea predated the Holocaust. The idea of Zionism, like I said, began in the 19th century and was influenced by other nationalist movements. If you remember, at the time, there were how many countries were around in the 19th century, right? Like the British Empire was, India became independent in 1948, for example. Like, so many countries were not, there was no Jordan, there was no Lebanon, there was no Syria. There was, all of these countries were just areas controlled by empires. You had the British, you had the Ottomans, Germanic Empire, you had the Russian Empire, right? So all of these empires controlled large swaths of land. Right. And in the 19th centuries, you had nationalism coming out as this kind of idea of national independence of people of certain linguistic or cultural identities, that they can form themselves as a nation people, as a national group. And so Zionism came out of that idea.
Just this time just goes by so quickly, and we just thank you for taking the time. And again, with you acknowledging that you personally have family and friends who have died even in the last couple of months during everything that's going on, which is just, our hearts go out to everyone. Maybe we could we finish with one last question? I'd love to hear.
I have two more questions, though.
Oh, you have. Well, I would just love to hear. I think our people need to hear some sort of, like, what could a solution be? It seems like there is no solution. Like, you know what I mean? Like you as a Palestinian Christian, what would your hope be? And maybe it's unrealistic. Maybe it can't. Maybe it won't happen. I'm not asking for a realistic one, but if you were to dream, what would a solution be that we Christians could pray for, or wish for, or dream for Jews and Palestinians in the Holy Land?
Yeah, and related to that, you mentioned dream. I think of Martin Luther King. He said, "I have a dream," and that was what when you quoted that and read that poem, it kind of sparked something in the U.S. And so, what is your dream, Daniel?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is there a different question you want to ask, Chris, before I address this one?
No. The next one.
That's a question that you have in mind.
A good follow-up. Yeah.
What is my dream and what's the solution? I guess I can answer that question about the dream, and then we can think of how can the dream come to life. The dream is that Palestinians and Israelis can live along side by side, alongside each other. Both would be given dignity and worth and humanity. I would love for my kids to grow up playing with making Israeli Jewish friends. I would love for them to visit them. I would love for Jewish kids to visit us in our home in Bethlehem, and both people groups to live in dignity and humanity and freedom and liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Situation of 76 years has been of one people group, the Jewish Israelis, who have complete domination, military domination, control of resources and land, and an oppressive military occupation over the Palestinians, a blockade of Gaza, and a military occupation entrenched in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, a system of segregation and apartheid. This is what the international community now, human rights organizations, are saying this is a system of apartheid. South Africans themselves, Alan Bozak, he's a South African theologian. I met with him recently. He was very active during the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He's saying he went to Palestine, and the situation in Palestine is worse than apartheid. To call the situation in Palestine as apartheid is an understatement. These are his words. So if you have a situation of apartheid, what is the hope? What is the solution? What is my dream? Is the end of apartheid? Is that people would be treated equally with dignity and a fair, equal application of law to everyone. Right now, we have an illegal control over our lands and our bodies and our rights, and that has to end. And the hope and the dream is for that to end, and we can think of what that could look like practically, politically. Just a quick note about Palestinian violence and Hamas, because people would say, well, you cannot have that. Daniel, you're being delusional. You have Hamas and you have militants. Armed struggle, the people's desire to use violence is very rational and very predictable. If you are oppressed, you feel that you have a right to bear arms. Americans in the US have believed in this idea of the Second Amendment, that you can have the right to bear arms while you talk with them. For me, it's abhorrent. Like I think violence in any form is abhorrent and against the gospel. You cannot love your neighbor and then believe in violence. For me, like that doesn't square with the gospel for me. But then you ask these Christians, like, why do you think it's okay to bear arms? And he says, well, also, if you look at the language of the Second Amendment, it says something to the effect of the right to bear arms should never be infringed, or the right to bear arms and to form militias would never be infringed. And you ask Christians, why do you believe in the Second Amendment? And I know people and family relatives of my wife. My wife is American from here. And they were like, we need to protect ourselves from the tyranny of the government. If the government is going to be tyrannical, we're going to defend ourselves using our guns. And that's the whole kind of Republican talking point. Hamas and other militias believe in the same thing, that they need to formulate militias to defend themselves against the tyranny of the government. This is not, now the difference though, this is not their own government that is being tyrannical. It's a foreign government, the Israeli government, that is not only in the future would oppress you, would be tyrannical towards you, it has been tyrannical towards you for the last 76 years. And many people feel like this makes sense. If this is, so Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East. It has the strongest, most powerful, biggest military in the Middle East. I think the fourth or the fifth in the whole world. Do you think that a Palestinian who faces oppression and violence by the drones and the Apaches and the tanks of Israel would not feel compelled to bear arms? So the struggle for the armed struggle for Palestinians is not different from the armed struggle of blacks in the US or Native Americans or South Africans or Indians or any indigenous people or others who feel oppressed by someone else, by a foreign government or a colonial power, what have you. The Algerians, the French, the Tunisian, that even the French, like against the violence of the empire, right? Any people group who are oppressed feel the desire to bear arms. Now, none of what I'm saying means I'm justifying what happened, or I think it's clear from what I've been saying. I think it's abhorrent, but it's understandable to me why people would bear arms. So what's the solution to Hamas? What should be done so that no people would feel compelled to carry arms and fight? There's a heard this statement from a anti-Zionist Jewish friend of mine. He said, "You can never underestimate a people's desire for freedom. You can never underestimate the desire of the Palestinians to be free." And people would use any means necessary to free themselves. And this has been a brutal, racist, apartheid system of oppression and violence and victimization. Palestinians are always going to resist. Israel can destroy Hamas. That's not going to stop Palestinian militancy or armed struggle or militias from forming. Two examples from history. I don't want to spend too much time here. And Nat Turner, he's a slave that led the Nat Turner revolt in the US. And he killed 50, 60 white men, women, and children. It's abhorrent, right? Like, why would he kill white women and children? Maybe men, the enslavers, okay, maybe I get it. But why would he kill children? But if we understand his context of slavery, of the trauma that he felt, could we understand why he did it? Yes. Not to justify it, but to understand what led him to violence. If you think about the Warsaw uprisings in World War II, like Jewish underground militias forming and fighting against the Nazis in Poland and otherwise. Abhorrent crimes committed by these militias. Do we understand why Jews in Europe felt compelled to attack Nazis? Yes. Do we justify it? No. But the context of violence helps us understand the reaction of violence. And there's a difference between systemic violence that we don't really see on TV, that has been normalized by people, and active violence that you see by these militias, by Hamas, by Nat Turner, and by others. But then what's the solution to another revolt by Nat Turner or someone else? Or the solution of not having Jews, killing Nazis? Is ending, racism, is ending segregation and bigotry and slavery and so on. And the end for Hamas, the end for any Palestinian or anyone else to carry weapons to fight, is the end of the militarized system of jeeps and tanks and soldiers and drones that have been killing them and victimizing them. So that solution is then inherently the end of the occupation, to be specific, the end of the apartheid system, the end of the Israeli military occupation, and the granting the Palestinians their freedoms. Per international law, per the UN resolutions, giving Palestinians their own autonomous, sovereign state in the land, and they can call it Palestine. And that is what we call the two-state solution, Chris, and it has been accepted by the vast majority of the world. Israel refuses to give it to the Palestinians because then they would have to give up land and power and control, and Israelis do not want that. But that's the international consensus. The Canadian government believes in this. U.S. government is talking about this right now. We have been talking about this for a while. My solution is not that. My solution is a one-state solution for both people. For example, Bethlehem is in the West Bank, in what would be called Palestine. But Bethlehem is inherently, historically, a Jewish town, right? David is from Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Nazareth, for example, is very Palestinian. Everyone in Nazareth is Palestinian right now. Everyone in Nazareth is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. But that would be in Israel. But Bethlehem would be in Palestine. Doesn't make sense. So if you could maybe swap them, But no, what makes sense is for everyone who wants to live in the land to live in the land. You want to call this home, call it home. You can live here, but live in freedom, in dignity, equal application of the law, and the security of everyone, the humanity of everyone. Justice is guaranteed for everyone, and that's the solution. Now, to your question, Chris, and to finish here, what should Christians do? I think Christians in the West, first of all, need to repent, need to spend some time repenting of adopting ideologies of racism and violence and war. They need to repent of dehumanizing Palestinians for so long. They need to re-examine their theology. They need to examine, and theology is so powerful. Like theology, we can never underestimate the power of theology and the role it plays in what's happening. If you listen to American politicians, especially Christians, they're driven by their theology, not really foreign policy. It's really their ideology that is born out of their theology. So you have to examine your theology. You have to repent of these theologies of violence and war. But then there's also, after you do that, there's a lot of work that you can be doing. Advocating politically, you can ask your church communities to be involved, to support Christians, to meet with Christian Palestinians. When you go to the Holy Land on trips, make sure you spend time with Palestinians, hear their stories, engage with them, think of ways to support them. You can right now send money to Gaza to support the people who are dying from hunger and thirst. There's plenty that can be done on the grassroots level and the church community level, in the political level. But also there's a lot of education that has to be done. I mentioned a few books, like people need to read and educate themselves and watch documentaries and read books and read what Palestinian Christians are writing and saying. I can provide a resource packet I developed, Kris and Chris, of like a collection of books and documentaries and movies that people can watch.
Please send those to us.
For sure, yeah, and if you can include them in the show notes. So yeah, there are resources, there are stuff that you can do. People in the West, in Canada and the US, have so much power and so much privilege and so much money and resources. Just ask God, how can I use my resources, my time, my money well? How can I love people like I love myself? And there's a lot that can be done, especially with what's happening in Gaza, the catastrophe in Gaza. There's a lot that can be done, and Christians need to step up and recant and give up those ideologies of violence and dehumanization and really follow after Jesus, follow after the way of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of peace and justice, to be peacemakers. This is like simple Matthew 5. Blessed are the peacemakers. How are we being peacemakers right now? Because right now what I'm seeing from Christians is like they're warmongers. They're not peacemakers. So there are practical ways they can do it, but I think that has to begin with self-inspection, self-reflection, and also education. And then there's plenty that can be done afterwards.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.
I could talk for many hours with you, just hearing more of your stories and your wisdom. I just love it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.